Unabating turf wars between minibus taxis, meter taxis and e-hailing drivers continue to put commuter lives at risk. And the state's delay in regulating properly integrating transport services is at the core of ongoing violence within the sector. Good evening, my name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh and welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight we ask, how long should citizens endure this violence? And does the state have its act together in regulating this sector? For this debate, let's welcome spokesperson for the National Department of Transport, Colin Msibi. We also welcome chairperson of the E-Hailing Partners Council, Henry Matebula, as well as Santaco spokesperson, Rebecca Pala. As usual, we welcome your contribution. Our Twitter handle is @Unfiltered SABC. Before we dive into our conversation, let's have a look at this scene setter.
For years, cars have been torched and lives lost. And across the country, e-hailing drivers have held multiple protests to no avail. The introduction of e-hailing services in South Africa 10 years ago has changed the game in the commuter transport industry. And while commuters have welcomed increased competition, industry players are at odds over preserving their piece of the pie in this lucrative multi-billion-rand industry. The latest outbreak of violence in Soweto's Maponya Mall and Protea Glen is the latest in a string of violent incidents across the country between minibus taxis, meter taxis and e-hailing operators. In these incidents, 4 cars belonging to e-hailing drivers were torched, leaving 2 people dead in Maponya Mall, Soweto. Minibus Taxi Association Santaco has denied responsibility.
What we're discussing here is a subject of police investigations, and so we want to allow police also to do their investigations so that at the end of the day we can get an understanding of who is suspected to be behind these acts.
The bill, introduced in 2016, aims to, among others, expand the powers of the transport minister to make regulations and to introduce safety measures in the passenger transport industry. It will also force e-hailing drivers to apply for operating licenses in order to ferry fee-paying passengers. Currently, the e-hailing industry operates outside of these parameters, and minibus taxi operators say this allows e-hailing drivers to encroach on their traditional territories, such as near the malls. But e-hailing drivers also hope that beyond resolving turf wars, regulation will also safeguard their rights against e-hailing companies, which they accuse of bad working conditions.
What are we working for? Even if we are working, there's no salary. Because the only thing that we are doing, we are just making those guys up there to be rich.
But it seems the bill has a long way to go after the Municipality Association SALGA rejected it last week, saying it's unconstitutional and could compromise the municipality's right to set out their development agenda. Genosi Kwene, Unfiltered.
Welcome back to Unfiltered, and thanks to my guests for joining me. Let's begin right with the most recent events at Maponya Mall. At least 7 cars seriously damaged, wounded, possibly even deaths. Could I start with you, Ms. Pala, from the Santaco perspective, because there have been some allegations that Santaco and taxi associations and even drivers have been to blame for this. Are your members to blame for this violence, most recently at Maponya Mall?
Good evening, Sizwe, and to your viewers. It is unfortunate what happened at Maponya Mall, as well as all the other platforms that you've already spoken about. As Santaco, we want to first convey our deepest apologies to commuters of public transport that they've been at the receiving end of the unfortunate incidents that have happened. Police are investigating these incidents. We are not police. We don't want to interfere with their work. We want to allow them to do their investigations, and as and when there are suspects, to effect arrests. Our members have been guided to cooperate with all the work that's being done by police, and would much rather ask also for South Africans to allow that process to unfold without making these allegations, which I feel add on to the problem as opposed to bringing in solutions of any sort?
Well, there have been long-standing allegations, and it's not just Maponya Mall. Ground Up, the investigative reporting independent hub, looked in 2021 at incidents around a mall in Gqeberha where a number of e-hailing drivers cited taxi associations, taxi drivers as hampering their work and threatening them. So the allegations don't come out of a vacuum, and there actually have been allegations within this Maponya incident that taxi drivers are angry that their routes are being impeded and they have a motive. So can you guarantee for us, are you sure that this violence wasn't perpetuated or perpetrated by any of your members?
It's going to be difficult for me to guarantee you if it was done by our members or not. The reality of the matter is that there's frustration. Like you said even in the preamble, we have been having this challenge for quite a while now. It's not too certain from the perspective of legislation as yet when this is going to be resolved. And so with all the allegations, as you put it, you don't talk about there having been prosecution, and so it means that they remain to be that. We would want to urge police to perhaps heighten their efforts, because even we are interested in finding out who is it that's behind this. We do not promote violence, and if it were to emerge that these people are our members, we will duly do also internal sort of processes that we follow, which obviously immediately means that people will have to be removed from working with us, because we do not promote violence in any way.
Mr. Matebula, from the e-hailing perspective, do you have any insight as to who's to blame for the recent events at Maponya?
Unfortunately not. We're just concerned because, 5 days after the incident that happened, then there is no lead. Something that happened in the mall, which has got cameras, something that happened in the vicinity of the hundreds of people, but nobody saw anything. Nobody can say anything that could lead to these people being arrested. It's so concerning. So, however, we cannot be sitting here and say it is the taxi people because we don't know. We're just hoping the police can, do their investigation, thorough investigation, and the mall also cooperating with the police so that these perpetrators can be brought to book.
What's strange for me when one looks at the video recordings purportedly from that time is that there seems to be a lot of effort on actually damaging the cars. I know that other people were also injured and there's allegations of even deaths. But there was a lot of focus on damaging the cars. And what I'm not sure about is why would anyone want to walk into a mall and just start damaging random cars? What would be the reason for doing that, if not it being associated with competition for routes? Do you have any insight onto that?
No, I wouldn't say I do have. As strange as it could sound, what we can do at the moment is to hope for the police to give us a perspective to say this is what happened and who are these people.
From the perspective of the government and at least the National Department of Transport, do you have any insights into what happened at Maponya Mall and who's to blame for these very tragic and worrying acts?
Well, thanks for the opportunity. We obviously, as government, would need to get to the bottom of it. And we are leaving it to the police to do their work. So the Department of Transport, we are quite concerned. Unfortunately, we are being blamed for not regulating. In fact, we are not sending anyone to be committing such barbaric acts of violence. So we're saying that we are quite concerned. We do know that there's issues of regulations that we will have to deal with. But we must understand it is only one part of the industry which is not captured in the legislation, and that is the e-hailing. And that is what we need to finish so that we make sure that it's finalized. But the rest of the industry, there is some regulations. There is part of it which needs to be accelerated when it comes to the minibus taxi industry, and we're working on that. But it is unfortunate what has happened in Soweto. We condemn it. The minister issued a statement condemning it. We continue to do so, but we urge the police to leave no stone unturned in terms of finding the perpetrators.
Are you In any discussions with the police, have you tried to escalate this matter with the police or taken any further steps to get to the bottom of the situation?
The issue of the taxi violence is high in the agenda of the net joints and the justice cluster. So we don't even have to go to them. It is part of what they have to do. It's a priority issue which they are looking into. So, but of course, the department is in touch with the police. We're trying to urge them to move faster so that we are able to deal with this. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about the operators, also the consumers or the users of the service are affected. So it is quite a huge concern for us.
And we will come to more of these questions of regulation in due course. But just on this question of what exactly happened and who's to blame, Santako, maybe you have some insight. You have said, Ms. Pala, that you're not going to be drawn on whether your members were indeed involved or not. Let the law take its course. But could there be any other culprits? We know that there is a certain degree of criminality around the industry, whether from the e-hailing side or the commuter minibus taxi side. So do you have any insights, if not your members, who might have been behind these very worrying events at Maponya?
Look, I'm very uncomfortable to answer that question because, again, it would mean then that I want to jeopardize what police are doing. The very question you're asking is the question that I would imagine the investigating officers involved in this matter are asking everyone that they consider to be a person of interest. We wouldn't want to even advance any theories. We feel that the discussion that we're having now and how South Africans immediately think that we could likely be behind these acts come because people are very quick to advance theories that have not been substantiated. And unfortunately, in this era where fake news sort of takes prominence quite a lot, it becomes very dangerous to say. Violence is not a very easy issue to talk about. We would want to tread very carefully, and that's why I would much rather allow the police to do their work.
But you do accept that this doesn't come out of nowhere, that the idea that fake news would be behind drawing an inference that there's potentially a link between minibus taxi violence, which is long-standing in South Africa, and e-hailing services, doesn't come out of nowhere. I think the question is trying to find a motive for why people would walk into a mall, burn the taxis of innocent people doing their work. So I'm not so sure it's fake news. It's a question of the public wanting to figure out and find out exactly who, and if not competitors, then who? Maybe there's a plausible alternative that you might be able to enlighten us on, which I'd also be quite interested to know about.
Sure. So that particular mentioning of fake news, I'm just showing a demonstration that we need to be very careful what we say about issues such as these, because it could spread out, being misunderstood, and lead to a lot more chaos, and we wouldn't want to get to that. We understand as the taxi industry why people will immediately suspect that we could be involved because, like you said just now, we are one of the longest standing public transport sector role players. So we understand that. People also seem to believe that we are opposed to competition and that would much rather only operate by ourselves. It is actually not necessarily that case, and that's why we have continuously been in conversation with government, even when the amendment of the NLTA first was spoken about, because we appreciate the reality that times are changing. The public transport sector has to be integrated. We believe that it's always been the case that we feed into each other. So contrary to what a lot of people say, because of misinformation, which then leads to that example I just gave you, we then have a lot more problems than we do solutions.
Mr. Matebula, there was an agreement reached today between the various players within Soweto's commuter travel ecosystem. Are you happy with that agreement, which seems to preclude e-hailing services from going within the mall? And are you satisfied that that is a fair agreement for now?
In fact, it was yesterday, the meeting happened yesterday. I can't say we're really happy, however, because at the end of the day, we're also concerned about our clients, and we know the kind of clients that we pick and drop every day. You know, when they request, they want you to come exactly at the point where you are. And if you don't go to the point where they either cancel, and if also you don't go to where you are, the way they are, the app companies somehow punishes you for canceling the trip. Because if she can't come out, then you will end up canceling the trip. And if you cancel the trip, the app companies, will punish you for that. Your ratings goes down. So that's why I'm saying we cannot be happy with that. However, it is something that which we can work on and we can live with at the moment, because from the meeting, it was only applying from yesterday, today, and tomorrow until after the meeting tomorrow.
We'll continue our conversation after the break, and we'll come back to discuss the regulatory environment and how it can be improved. See you after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing e-hailing, minibus taxi conflicts recently brought to bear in the Maponya Mall incident, and we're in conversation with government, with Santaco, and with representation from e-hailing institutions. Mr. Msibi, before we left for the break, in your response, you spoke about regulation. And one of the curious things at the moment regarding this industry is the National Land Transport Amendment Act has still not been passed. And I believe this amendment began as far back as 2016. So, I mean, we're nearly hitting the decade mark of it not being passed. What is taking so long, and why hasn't the urgency that's required to regulate this industry been seen?
Well, let me first of all say, in the initial stages of the amendment, I don't think anyone anticipated that we quite dealing with quite a huge industry, which is the e-hailing industry. So it had to go through the consultation with the industry. And at some point it went to Parliament, and it passed, and then it went to the President. But there was an issue with the constitutionality of the amendment bill. So the President sent it back, and that is why now there is consultation. Some of it is ending tomorrow. So we believe that with that process completed, the Act is going to go back to Parliament, and then it can be sent back to the President for signing. But what does the amendment bill say? Basically, we're saying that there has to be the regulation of the e-hailing operation, because we believe that at the moment the perception is that they do as they please. Is the perception that we are getting in terms of having to operate wherever, and they are obviously using the technology that they have. And this is the perception that we get. So we're saying that with the regulations, we've got to look deeper in terms of what is it that they need to do. Whether it's in terms of the standards of the vehicles, we have to be concerned about the issues of roadworthiness of the vehicles that are being used, the fitness of the drivers that are being used, but also we need to look at the requirements in terms of the application for the operating licenses. So those things need to be set in stone. So we also have to look then at the issues of the offenses, because you must remember, while you regulate, there's going to be the guys who are operating illegally. So you've got to say in the regulations, how do we then deal with those who are operating illegally in the sector? So the regulations, we believe, are going to assist us in dealing with that particular issue. But right. Going back to...
And that all seems fair, but 7 years to get to those regulations, I mean, even with the President sending a bill back, that's a very long time to be still figuring out what the regulations are going to be. By 2016, the e-hailing industry was well known, and it was quite set in South Africa, let alone the rest of the world.
Well, indeed. I mean, I've said this before. We are the first to admit that the period has been very long. And the President sending it back, obviously, if there's issues of constitutionality, we can't proceed and sign into law something that you know that may be challenged. So we need to accept that that time has obviously been a very long one, and it has passed. But let's focus now in terms of what is it that we can be able to achieve.
Ms. Phala, what's your view on the regulatory environment? Do you think regulations are adequate at the moment? Would you like to see more speed with regulations being implemented? where does Santaco sit on this amendment bill and the wider regulatory environment so that we can actually have a set of laws that keep commuters and drivers safe?
Our reflective perspective is that majority of some of these incidents that are happening would be avoided if there was proper regulation in place and every stakeholder understood what jurisdiction they operate within and exactly what the limitations are. So whilst we hear that they wouldn't want to then rush into it only to find that a lot of things were missed in the process, we still feel that a lot more needs to be done. It is incredibly frustrating for all of us. And we would really wish that they could do it a bit more speedily than it has been dealt with to this point.
And Mr. Msibi, I will allow you to respond, but your views, Mr. Matebulo, on the regulatory environment, do you feel that regulations are adequate for the e-hailing industry? What's your view on what we've heard so far?
Regulation is a need for the e-hailing industry because also as the role players in the space, because I think most of the times there is a misunderstanding here. Operators in the e-hailing space, at the moment, they are regulated via the practice note. We do acquire permits, which is a meter taxi permit. So the part of the e-hailing sector that is not regulated, it is the technological companies. So I understand that there is still a lot of people from the e-hailing space that do not have permits, but there is people that also have permits, just like in any other sector. So it is a need for a regulation for the e-hailing industry because also we are, without regulation as e-hailing operators, we are vulnerable to the technological companies because they can do anything as they wish. They don't take accountability on anything. We have been crying about issues of safety. Regulation will speak to those kind of issues in which it will say this is the standard in terms of safety and security that technological companies, in order to operate, must meet. Now, at the moment, there is nothing. You see, so that's why I'm saying there is a need. And we are crying for it every day. However, while we're still speaking about regulation, if something is taking too long, there are measures. So what I'm seeing here is from the government side, there is a lack of will in order to assist the industry, in order to bring the harmony and good working relationship between the counterparts. Because if ever regulation is still outstanding, like they did with the practice notes, in the absence of regulation, in the absence of the bill, that which is not the bill, that the current bill is not mentioning e-hailing. However, in the absence of the bill that is mentioning e-hailing, they introduce a practice note. So even in the issues that we are having now, we could come up with something. Like for instance, in 2020, we sat with the provincial government and we agreed on a licensing committee that will be inclusive of meter taxi, minibus taxi, the department, community safety policing and municipal policing, and also from the national side of things, and also labor. And even the technological companies, Uber and Bolt, were involved in that conversation. And we said, in the meantime, let's have a licensing committee that will speak on the issues so that those issues can be addressed. And right. I believe if ever it was implemented, we could be somewhere today.
Mr. Msibi, how do you respond to some of the views that have been shared within the industry in terms of the need for more urgency with the amendment bill, but also maybe intermediary steps that could plug some of the gaps while we wait for the amendment?
Look, I think one of the measures we took to close the gap, it was exactly what he is referring to in terms of the practice note. There is the operating licenses that they are using for the charter service. So that is in place, but that was just for the immediate. So we need for the long term, as I said, Parliament is consulting at the moment, and that process we unfortunately cannot influence in terms of ensuring that it moves faster. But we're optimistic because we've been told, for instance, some of these consultation or hearings that are taking place, some of them are ending tomorrow. So we believe that once that is done and it goes back to NCOP, and it's going to be adopted in Parliament. So it is something, unfortunately, our hands are tied. We cannot say, Parliament, do this quicker, because there is a problem. And I suppose the parliamentarians, they have constituencies, they're quite aware of what is happening. So we believe that would even push them to do something about it so that it moves quite quicker.
Just briefly, do you have any sense of when the amendment bill process will come to an end, or any estimate within the department of when you think this process could end?
Hence, I'm saying that is out of our control. It can go to the Parliament only to find there's still problems. So it becomes very difficult to determine a time frame on a parliamentary process. So unfortunately, I cannot answer you in terms of the time frames.
We're in conversation with various role players across the transport industry, looking at recent spates of violence around e-hailing services and how the different sectors of this industry can come together to create a safer environment for transport for the public and those involved in the industry. Remember, at Unfiltered SABC is our hashtag. We look forward to your comments on social media, and we'll try to get to some of those. Join us after the break as we deepen our conversation. Welcome back to Unfiltered, and we're in conversation with various role players in the taxi industry in South Africa to discuss the recent violence at Maponya Mall, but also how we can create a more safe experience for the public as they transport to their various destinations. Before we get into our conversation a bit further, let's look at what you've been saying on social media and have a look at some of your tweets. So Future Assets says, the problem is that people think that they own us as commuters when we use our own money and have the right to choose which mode of transportation we want to use. Taxi operators are left by the government to be a law unto themselves. Government can't touch them. Let's take a look at some more. The Observer says, everyone knows that the minibus taxi drivers / associations are behind all the arson, whether trains, buses or cars, and it would appear there are many SAPS and other agencies who are members of these syndicates and have much to lose. Think Eskom. Some more. As always, says Was Embo, as always, this government is waiting for the wounds to fester before they could take actions to intervene. But as we saw in the looting, it has now been discovered that this country is a free-for-all: murders, crime, buildings hijackings, construction mafia, the filth and general lawlessness, etc. And let's go to the last tweet for now. Placius says, what the representative of the Department of Transport is saying here, in plain English, is there's a lack of urgency that's inherent in the ruling party. Absolutely no political will to take action, even when lives are being lost. Would you like to respond to some of those tweets and your thoughts on those before we get back into our conversation? Mr. Msibi, there were some there for you about the urgency from the department.
Look, I think we accept. We have to take the blame for the delays, but we've also said that there's a need to move quite urgently, and we've said it. Part of these things are out of our control, as I said, so we would want to move as speedily as possible so that we can resolve this matter. But I do want to say as well, in 2020 we had what we call a taxi lekgotla. And part of the resolutions of the taxi lekgotla, we've had to look at what is it that can be done together with the industry, particularly the minibus taxi industry, in terms of dealing with issues of violence. Part of the resolution is that we must establish the Taxi Violence Law Enforcement Unit. It is something that is being discussed as we speak, so that that unit can look into these kind of issues, including the issues of law enforcement. When we introduce regulations, there has to be that kind of a unit that also monitors whether those things are being implemented. So it is part of the things that we are doing. So honestly, I think even having the taxi lekgotla, it was an indication on our part to say we're quite serious about this public transport in general, but in particular the issues of taxi industry.
But the lekgotla was in 2020, as you say, and here we are 3 years later, and we still don't have that enforcement agency. So isn't that
Yeah.
once again
So,
an example of the long delays in this industry? And for those who lose their cars or are wounded, that's cold comfort that this is still in the works, as it were.
Look, there's a bouquet of resolutions that came out of the taxi Lekgotla. So it's not just one area that we look at. You must understand, when you introduce such things, we need to look at the legislation once again in terms of how we're going to introduce it. So it's not just waking up in the morning and say, boom, I've got law enforcement units. So you've got to follow the processes to be able to introduce it. So it's a plethora of things that we're looking at, including the issues of the saturation of the taxi industry. They've come up and said to us, you need to look at the number of people who are wanting to enter the taxi industry as operators. Aren't we having enough numbers already? So what is it that government is going to do? So we're looking at the moratorium to look at all those buffet of issues.
Any further responses to some of the tweets we heard on social media?
Sure. I think, Sizwe, and your viewers, you would appreciate to know that as Santaco mainstream, just recently, we integrated the meter taxi sector into being a subsidiary of Santaco, with Santaco then being the apex body. By meter taxi, we're referring to those who have been operating at a traditional sort of pace, as opposed to using these e-hailing apps. I think that kind of move goes to show that, one, we are not opposed to integration, but two, we appreciate seamless working relations as long as everybody understands what the jurisdictions are. And so when people seem to think then that we are a law unto ourselves and that we want to tell people what mode of transport to use, it's not necessarily true. What we like and what we appreciate is law and order. We don't want instances where people do as they please and you just have people randomly coming to your sort of area that's been jurisdicted for you. And so it's not necessarily correct. If anything, that particular integration of the meter taxis, we had a summit in Durban just last month, and there were resolutions drawn from that, which coincide and echo the sentiments of what Mr. Msibi just mentioned now, the resolutions of the Lekgotla that we had. It goes to show that we are interested in the empowerment, the unity of the industry, as well as the transformation thereof. We just want things to be clear for all stakeholders.
Could I also just ask on that, based on something Mr. Matebula said earlier, because the agreement that comes out of what recently happened at Maponya Mall means that there are some restrictions on e-hailing services actually entering the inside of the mall, which is something that we see maybe not officially, but often where there are malls or other kind of commuter areas concerned. Is that fair to say to commuters, actually you have to walk outside of the gate, subject yourself to potentially safety risks, just to accommodate for the conflicts that are going on between the different providers? Do you think you've placed conditions that are actually harming commuters and the wider industry?
I think we need to be careful of the wording that we use in that particular regard. I just mentioned to you now that it's important that we have order. Some of the reports that have emerged as the media is following on this story is that there are some from the e-hailing sector who, when kicked out by these applications, they start literally going to commuters and offering to ferry them at a lesser rate. That essentially is something that would ordinarily be done by a taxi marshal in a taxi rank. That confuses things for us, especially because it hasn't really been documented in any sort of legislation. So it's not necessarily to say that we are harming, it's that we want for things to be in order, for every role player to know what their jurisdiction is. And when you look at the cases of these agreements having been drawn, because it's not just with STS as was agreed upon yesterday, we've got a few other cases of stakeholders on the ground agreeing to these things, because we need to know who is operating where. If commuters were to appreciate that reality as well, it would then be a collective effort, one that would ensure that there's unity and essentially things happen as they should seamlessly.
Mr. Matebula, how do you respond to that?
I'm very much concerned about the statement that was made by the department or by the government to say at the moment, some of the things are not in our control. I mean, we're talking about the lives of people here. Just this year alone, from the e-hailing side, there's been over 30 people that I got the reports of that are dying. In 2020, we marched and went to the office of the minister. It was still Fikile Mbalula was the minister. We never got any response. And we went there again in 2021. We never got any response. And we were coming with issues that which are burning, and we were coming with suggestions of things that which we want in order for us to can work freely and safely and be able to coexist with other mode of transport. Because it is not nice for me, if I'm going to pick up, I'm busy looking at my shoulder. And the government is saying some of the things are not in their control. I mean, if the government is not in control of the situations and what is happening to its people, who has to come up with a solution?
Well, I just want to respond to that. I think it mustn't be taken out of context. When we say out of our control, we mean the parliamentary process. That's basically what we are talking about, because, as I said earlier, we cannot tell parliamentarians to move quicker on the matter. We can only impress on the agents of it, but we cannot tell them that, okay, leave everything else, focus on this one. That's basically what I'm referring to by that. But I also want to say that a perception must not be created that when we regulate the e-hailing, we will going to now determine in terms of the routes that they're going to be using. It's not that. So when we say we are going to regulate, it doesn't mean that we'll use like in the minibus taxis where we're going to say, so-and-so, you're going to use this specific route for your operating licenses. This sector is determined by the users as to where they want to go. So it is entirely up to the request that they get and where they want to go. So it cannot be that when this coexistence is seen to be a problem, and therefore we need to channel certain the e-hailers to operate here and for the minibus taxis to be operating elsewhere. So the e-hailers, it's just impossible to assign a specific route. It's just like the issue of the pricing. How are you going to do that? Because it is against the Competition Commission Act. You can't say, for this specific, when you live here and you go to the campus square, it's going to be 50 Rand as a department, and therefore you have to also determine from here, let's say to Wits University, you can't, there's going to be so many routes. How are you going to manage that? So it is a problem. So I think there needs to be that understanding that when we regulate, it's not going to be like we have to assign the routes like we do with the operating licenses for the taxi industry. We're not going to be doing that.
Absolutely, and we'll come back with further discussion on the actual technology companies that are often at the heart of these questions, who we also need to put under the spotlight. We've been in conversation with various role players in South Africa's taxi commuter ecosystem, from e-hailing to Santaco and the National Department of Transport. Stick with us, because we're going to, in the final segment of this show, look at ways forward, potential solutions, and also put under the spotlight some of the global technology companies who also need to be held to account for the disruptions and the disturbances that we see to the public. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Thank you for continuing this conversation with us. After the recent events at Maponya Mall, where at least 7 vehicles were badly damaged, we're looking into the experience of the public as they use different forms of transport on our roads, from minibus taxis to meter taxis to e-hailing services. Mr. Matebula, the E-Hailing Partners Council is not just about drivers, but also about the industry. To what extent do you think the e-hailing industry, including its technology companies, themselves also have some questions to ask about whether they are accountable, whether they have made room for the disruptions they've created to other industries, and not placed us in a position where there are these constant violent forms of competition?
They are entirely responsible for the disturbances. and this somebody that which is there in the industry. First, when they came in from the side of the government, they've accepted that they never thought, it will be as big as it is, and they never really researched to know how it's going to operate, and that created the gap. And as a result, meter taxis, you were having questions as to how do these people operate and all that. From the government side, someone would have expected some sort of workshop to get people to really understand so that they can be able to be accepting of this mode of transport. Even from the minibus taxis, there's been that thing, because when we are stopped sometimes by these other counterparts, they're asking us those questions because they don't really understand. So that's where we are saying the coming of the technological companies has created a lot of disturbances to the industry, and they are to be blamed. However, not all is lost, because if you come into my house, there must be some rules. I understand the regulation is yet to come. However, if ever it's creating the chaos that which we are seeing at the moment, somebody must do something. Definitely so.
And you'll be seeing, as viewers, some of the jobs that have been created by the e-hailing industry. And so we should also bear in mind that there are costs and benefits to the way, yes, there have been disturbances to the industry, but also we have to weigh that up against job creation. And so, Ms. Pala, I would also ask you, because you spoke about the need for order in the industry and alluded to the fact that it can't be a free-for-all. What do you think about the extent to which the competitors to you have been fair in their expectations of the pre-existing industry?
I don't think that there's been much consideration for that, and that's why they operate in the way that they do. The counterpart from the e-hailing sector uses the idea of intrusion of sorts when one just gets into somebody else's house, and it obviously begs a question of territory. I don't think that they've made much consideration to that, and that's why we're here. Then it begs the question to say, why then are they opposed when in the interim the industry then says, let's much rather have an understanding so that we don't disrupt that which was existing before the technology was introduced.
Mr. Msibi, you also alluded early on in the program to some perceptions around the global companies and the extent to which they have expected great concessions. Do you think the government has done enough to regulate this big global power? There are many countries where these big e-hailing companies really have to integrate much more deliberately into the existing economy than we have seen in South Africa.
Well, I would say that part of changing the laws, it is one of the things we're doing in terms of the integration of this particular industry. Because without that, we still have this huge industry which is supposed to be moving with the times. In fact, everybody else, with the technology that we have, it means that the public transport industry is moving to a specific period. So we need to have acceptance, the fact that it is here. So we need to find a way to say, what is it that can be done, therefore to live with it? Let me say that the regulations, for instance, are not going to look at the technology that we have, that they use in this particular industry. We've got to incorporate the ICASA as part of this process, because they understand those issues, they understand the technology that is being applied. As Transport Department, we are not in that particular space. So we need that kind of assistance, because this is a new animal that we have to deal with. So we need to find a way, and we cannot, because, I mean, there's been an appreciation from the users in terms of this particular service. So we therefore need to move with the times. So there was, at some point, issues of violence between the meter taxis and the e-hailing. But there was natural acceptance after to say, this thing is here to stay, we might as well live with it. And in fact, some of the meter taxi operators, they are already into the e-hailing. So the point I'm making is that it is here to stay with us, so we need to find a way to adapt And part of it, including this issue of technology, how do we deal with it? Because it's not going to be accommodated in the regulations. We need to find a way. ICASA must be brought on board to be able to assist us.
In terms of ways forward and solutions to the crisis of violence between different players and even sometimes the public and those who offer transport services, what are the kinds of things that maybe haven't been tabled that we can look at going forward to avert the kinds of things we saw at Maponya Mall just recently?
I don't necessarily think that there's anything that hasn't been tabled which suggests to be a solution. I think what really is remaining now is a question of implementation, a question of a sense of urgency with respect to the protocols that have to be observed in those particular regards. Sure.
In terms of what's there then,
Sure.
if you're saying that what's on the table is adequate, what do you think are the key interventions that need the most urgent priorities?
Clear jurisdiction. We need to clearly know who operates until where. There needs to be mutual respect. I think it will come naturally when the messaging of the jurisdictions has been cascaded down. We're also very concerned about the aspect of safety from the perspective of the apps, and we would want that to also be looked into. It gives the public transport sector a bad image when every once in a while you will report of unfortunate incidents where people are, subject to varied forms of crime under the disguise of the operation of these technologies. Sure.
Mr. Matebula, in terms of solutions and the way forward, what do you think are the key priorities? What are the things we can do to take this question forward so that the public and the industry are at harmony?
Definitely, these app companies need to be engaged. And I believe that the government must, put its foot down. They are the custodian of the country and or whatever that which is happening in this country. So what I can say at the moment, I'll say the licensing committee that which was there, as the e-hailing committee, we are calling for its resuscitation. And there was participation from NTA, there was participation from Santaco, the government and app companies had come on board as well. And I believe it will be on that table that, all the things that which from the meter taxi questions that they are having, that will be able to ask and they can be addressed. Because some of the things as operators, even if we can come in and agree with the taxi people, they cannot be implemented because they depend on the app. So as we sit on the table, we cannot sit on the table alone with other role players, whereas e-hailing is dependent also on the app. So we are calling for the resuscitation of that licensing committee with immediate effect so that we can start looking on how in the meantime, how we can create, a better space for everyone.
And to what extent are you getting a sense that drivers are feeling unsafe after they see the recent events, the murder of a Bolt driver in April, what happened now with e-hailing services in Maponya? Is there a sense that this is an unsafe profession?
It is unsafe. That's why we are so concerned that, government must really do more. As I'm calling to say, they must put their foot down. You cannot be allowing, a death trap in the name of the technological company to continue doing as they wish in your country, and then you're not doing anything. They must be brought to the table and be asked. Let's see your safety measures. Let's see, what you are doing about these questions that are on the ground, and they must be able to answer. So drivers are not safe. They know. It's just that we are in South Africa in which there are no jobs. I see on the screen there was the creation of 29,000 jobs. They are not really jobs, let me tell you. People, they drive for 18 hours, 20 hours without sleeping. That's why a lot of accidents are happening. And at the end of the day, your car is dying, but what you are bringing on the table is nothing. As we keep on making noise, it is not because we are, we like making noise, we want to be recognized. It is because there is a lot of exploitation.
Mr. Msibi, could I ask you to close out with some final thoughts, both on the solutions and your final views from the perspective of the department, especially in terms of what we can expect urgently while the amendment bill is still making its way through the legislative works?
Okay. 3 things from us. One is the issue of the visibility of the police. I think it is important so that we are able to quell violence that is happening at the moment. So it is important that we engage, even the province, I'm told that they are already speaking to the police to address that matter, because without the visibility of the police, you continue to have these problems. So that is key. The second part of it is that we're going to accelerate the issues of drafting of the regulations. We already started with that process while we await the amendment bill to be passed. So that we don't wait and we say, okay, now it has been passed, now we're going to start with the regulations. We've started with that. And then once it is passed, we're going to go into the gear of public hearings and to consult the industry and so forth, so that we can finalize that. And we believe it is going to be the key in terms of regulating the space. I think she's quite right. We need to know who's operating where. So in terms of the e-hailing, we can only indicate where they start and where they end, but we can't say which directions they're going to go. The third part, we're saying that we want to accelerate the issue of the resolutions of the taxi lekgotla. Part of it is the unity and leadership in the taxi industry. So there has to be coexistence. Part of it then speaks to the issues of violence, because once there is this unity, then it brings violence that we see. There's going to be the issue of the regulation and control. And we need to look at the saturation of the industry and see how we can be able to control that.
Let me thank you all very much for joining us and giving our audience insights into the industry. Getting from point A to point B has often become a difficult task for the ordinary South African, and today we've tried to delve into the reasons behind this. Can the violence that has continued to erupt between various members of those who offer transport services to South African public, can it be stemmed? Can it be quelled? Well, that's up for you to decide. We look forward to your conversations on social media at Unfiltered SABC. And make sure you continue to tune in to the show that has the nation talking. Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and we'll see you on the next installment.